welcome to your deep dive. Looks like we're really going to get into Sheriff Joe Arpaio, huh?
Yeah, should be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a pretty fascinating stack of sources here,
What's like it, yeah?
including excerpts from Sheriff Joe Arpaio, an American legend, which he co-wrote with David Thomas Roberts.
Oh, wow.
So we'll be uncovering, his whole life story, those controversial law enforcement tactics, and the impact he had on American politics.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to immigration, right?
Yeah. His story, it really goes way beyond those headlines about pink underwear and tent city.
Yeah.
What I find really interesting is how his career reflects these major tensions we see in American society. Things like the war on drugs, the rise of that tough on crime era, and of course the never-ending debate about immigration.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kick things off, we're starting with Arpaio's roots. Born in Springfield, Massachusetts to Italian immigrant parents, you'd think with his father being such a big believer in education, Arpaio would have taken a more academic route.
It's true. Instead, at 18, right after high school, he joins the Army. It's the Korean War era, and he's off to boot camp at Fort Dix. Can you imagine that? Trading textbooks for a rifle?
Yeah, it's a pretty stark contrast. And then, wouldn't you know it, his Sicilian fiancée breaks off their engagement because he becomes a DC beat cop. I guess she wasn't too keen on him facing danger on the job.
Well, to be fair, he was assigned to one of the most dangerous beats in the country at the time. Think about it. He was assaulted 18 times in a single year. That's a baptism by fire if I've ever heard of one.
That's insane. It really makes you wonder how those early experiences shaped his tough on crime stance later on, right?
Absolutely. It's like that old saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
And that's certainly true for Arpaio. Those early years on the force definitely toughened him up.
Yeah, they did. And it seems like he wasn't afraid of a challenge. I mean, the guy actually requested to be assigned to that tough beat.
That speaks volumes about his personality, doesn't it? He wasn't someone who shied away from confrontation. He ran towards it.
He did. And speaking of running towards things, after DC, he briefly joined the Las Vegas Police Department. But then, and this is where things get really interesting, he joins the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which later became the DEA.
Oh, wow. Talk about a career shift. This is where we see him tackling organized crime and those major drug trafficking rings. His assignments were like something straight out of a spy thriller. Undercover in Chicago, check. Istanbul, check.
It's wild. He was even sent to Turkey to infiltrate a massive drug smuggling operation, the infamous French Connection, a major source of heroin entering the U.S. at the time.
Yeah, and this is where Arpaio makes a huge impact. He orchestrates the largest opium bust in the world, over a ton.
Wow.
That work in Turkey was crucial in taking down the entire French Connection network.
Incredible. So after years of chasing criminals across continents, Arpaio returns to the U.S., holds several leadership positions within the DEA, and eventually lands in Arizona as the special agent in charge.
And that's a pivotal moment, isn't it? It gives him this intimate understanding of border issues, which, as we know, becomes a defining aspect of his time as sheriff of Maricopa County.
It really does. So let's talk about that transition from federal agent to sheriff. In 1992, he retires from the DEA, runs for sheriff, and wins. But he wasn't going to be your typical lawman.
That's an understatement. He came in with a mission to shake things up.
Oh, yeah.
Arpaio saw what he considered to be inefficiencies and a blatant waste of taxpayer money. So he rolls out these cost-saving measures and controversial policies that would make him a household name.
Oh, we all remember those headlines. Tent City Jail, pink underwear for inmates, and the revival of chain gangs.
Yeah, these tactics, they were meant to be both cost-effective and serve as a deterrent to crime, right? His belief was that jail should be uncomfortable, a place people would want to avoid at all costs. But of course, these measures sparked intense debate about their effectiveness and even their humanity.
Yeah, it's that debate that makes Arpaio such a compelling figure, right? He was unapologetically tough, and his approach really challenged conventional thinking about law enforcement. But it also raised some fundamental questions, about the balance between punishment and rehabilitation. And we have to consider the role of law enforcement in a diverse society.
Exactly, and those questions became even more prominent as his time as sheriff went on, especially with his focus on cracking down on illegal immigration.
Right. He took a very hardline stance. He worked closely with ICE to identify, arrest, and detain undocumented immigrants. He even formed that massive volunteer posse to assist with those efforts.
3,000 strong at its peak. The posse was another example of his unconventional approach. It gave both praise and criticism. Some saw it as a valuable community resource, while others worried about vigilantism and racial profiling.
And those concerns intensified when his cold case posse launched an investigation into the authenticity of President Obama's birth certificate.
Yeah, that move put Arpaio right in the national spotlight and further fueled accusations of racism.
He wasn't exactly subtle about it either, holding press conferences, claiming the document was forged.
Right.
That definitely got a reaction, especially from the Obama administration and the media.
It's fascinating how that investigation, which started as a response to concerns from Tea Party groups, turned into such a lightning rod issue, right? It really tapped into those broader anxieties about Obama's legitimacy and the direction the country was heading in.
No doubt about it. And just when you thought things couldn't get any wilder, Arpaio gets tangled up with this self-proclaimed whistleblower named Dennis Montgomery. This guy claimed the government was illegally spying on citizens using a supercomputer called, the Hammer.
It was a wild story, wasn't it? Montgomery alleged that the Hammer could access all sorts of private information, phone records, bank accounts, emails, and was being used for surveillance and even blackmail.
So Arpaio, always one to jump into the fray, assigns investigators to work with Montgomery. They spent a considerable amount of time and resources trying to verify those claims.
Yeah, but here's the twist. They start finding inconsistencies in Montgomery's story. Despite the initial hope that he had groundbreaking evidence, doubts began to surface about his credibility.
Yeah, it seems like even Arpaio, known for his bold moves, might have gotten caught up in a web of intrigue that was more complex than he anticipated.
Absolutely. And as all this was going on, Arpaio is facing mounting legal challenges stemming from his immigration enforcement tactics. The ACLU and the Justice Department sued him for racial profiling.
That was the beginning of a long and arduous legal battle for Arpaio, wasn't it? He was eventually found in civil contempt of court by federal judge G. Murray Snow.
And it didn't end there. He was later found in criminal contempt for continuing those immigration enforcement efforts despite a court order.
Which ultimately led to a 6-month jail sentence. But in a move that surprised many, he received a pardon from President Trump.
Talk about a dramatic turn of events. But this really highlights how Arpaio was, and still is, a polarizing figure who attracted both fervent supporters and staunch critics.
It does. His story embodies those complexities of American society, our struggles with immigration, the limits of power, and the ongoing debate about what justice really means.
And as we move forward in our deep dive, it's crucial to keep those questions in mind. We'll be exploring the details of the Melendres trial, the Obama birth certificate investigation, and his later political ambitions.
All right, well, buckle up because we're about to unpack some of the most controversial chapters in Arpaio's story. Okay, so we've dug deep into this Melendres trial.
Yeah.
And it really was a turning point, in Arpaio's career, not to mention a flashpoint in the whole national immigration debate.
Absolutely. It was much bigger than just one arrest.
Right.
You had this clash of ideologies.
Right.
Arpaio representing that zero-tolerance approach to illegal immigration, while the ACLU and Justice Department argued his tactics were, well, flat-out discriminatory.
Yeah, the core issue was whether Arpaio's deputies were racially profiling Latinos.
Right. Exactly.
Specifically targeting them during traffic stops and other law enforcement activities.
Exactly. But it gets into tricky legal territory.
Yeah.
Arpaio's argument was that his deputies were simply enforcing existing immigration laws.
Right.
Particularly after Arizona passed SB 1070, which made being in the country illegally a state crime.
SB 1070 was super controversial, wasn't it?
Oh, hugely.
What impact did that have on how Arpaio approached immigration enforcement?
Massive impact. It emboldened him, really. But the plaintiffs, in the Melendres case, they argued that he went way beyond simply enforcing the law.
Right.
They presented evidence that Latinos were disproportionately stopped, questioned, and detained, even when there was no probable cause for a crime other than their perceived immigration status.
So how did Arpaio respond to those accusations?
He denied any wrongdoing, of
Right.
course, insisted his deputies followed proper procedures,
Right.
and that race was never the sole factor in determining whether to stop or detain someone.
Okay, but the court ultimately sided with the plaintiffs, right?
They did. Judge Snow found that Arpaio's office had engaged in a pattern of unconstitutional practices.
And that led to some major changes, didn't it?
Absolutely. The ruling resulted in court-ordered reforms to prevent racial profiling,
Right.
including increased oversight and new training protocols for deputies.
Yeah.
It was a significant blow to Arpaio's authority.
Yeah.
and a real victory for those who'd been criticizing his immigration tactics for years.
It really showed that even a sheriff with a reputation for being tough on crime isn't above the law.
Exactly. Accountability applies to everyone, no matter how powerful they might seem.
Okay, so let's switch gears for a minute and talk about that Obama birth certificate investigation.
Yeah,
This was a side of Arpaio that really caught the public's attention.
I did.
Some saw him as a truth seeker, while others called him a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, it's interesting how this investigation, which started with Arpaio's cold case posse, it tapped into this wellspring of distrust and suspicion that was already kind of bubbling under the surface, in certain segments of society.
Right, it was a pretty charged political climate at the time.
It was.
You have Obama, the first black president, and there was a lot of racially charged rhetoric surrounding his election and presidency.
Yeah, and some of that rhetoric latched onto Obama's birthplace.
Right.
People questioning whether he was truly born in the United States and therefore eligible to be president.
Which, of course, is a constitutional requirement to hold the office.
Right. And even though the White House released Obama's birth certificate,
Yeah,
some people still clung to doubts about its authenticity.
right.
Arpaio, spurred on by concerns from those Tea Party groups, decided to launch an investigation.
Yeah, and he didn't exactly shy away from the spotlight, did he? He held press conferences, gave interviews, even wrote a book laying out his supposed findings, claiming the birth certificate was a forgery.
It's important to note that fact checkers and legal experts widely disputed and debunked Arpaio's claims. There was simply no credible evidence to back them up.
But that didn't stop the investigation from having a lasting impact, did it? It further polarized public opinion about Obama, fueled those conspiracy theories, and really cemented Arpaio's image as this controversial figure who challenged the status quo no matter what.
Absolutely, and it demonstrated the power of misinformation, how easily it spreads, especially in our digital age. Even though Arpaio's claims were debunked, they're still circulating online today.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we have to be really, really careful about the information we consume and share,
Right.
especially in an environment where misinformation is so rampant.
Now, speaking of questionable information, we have to talk about Arpaio's involvement with Dennis Montgomery, the quote-unquote whistleblower who claimed the government was spying on its citizens.
This whole episode feels like a scene out of a spy movie, you know?
Mhm.
Montgomery comes to Arpaio with this wild tale about a supercomputer called the Hammer being used for illegal government surveillance.
Right, sounds like something straight out of a Tom Clancy novel.
Oh, right.
But Arpaio, always the one to confront perceived injustice, assigns investigators to work with Montgomery. They spend months, and I mean months, trying to verify those claims.
It seems like Arpaio's tendency to choice controversy might have clouded his judgment here.
Yeah.
I mean, did he really believe this supercomputer existed?
It's hard to say for sure, but much like the birth certificate investigation, doubts quickly arose about Montgomery's credibility. The evidence he presented was either fabricated or unsubstantiated.
So Arpaio's own investigators eventually conclude that Montgomery was a fraud. What did Arpaio do then?
You'd think that would be the end of it. But even after his team debunked Montgomery's claims, Arpaio defended his decision to work with him.
What was his reasoning?
He argued that even if the information was false, it was worth investigating any potential government wrongdoing.
That's a slippery slope, though, isn't it? Where do you draw the line between pursuing justice and getting caught up in conspiracy theories?
It's a great question. The Montgomery episode, like so many others in Arpaio's career, really highlights that tension. It just shows how difficult it can be to separate fact from fiction, especially when you're dealing with someone who's so willing to embrace controversy.
Okay, so let's move on to the later chapters in Arpaio's story. After he leaves office in 2016, following his defeat in the sheriff's race, he wasn't quite done with public life, was he?
Not at all. In 2018, at 86 years old, he decided to run for the U.S. Senate in Arizona.
Wow.
His goal was to support President Trump's agenda and bring his brand of law and order to Washington.
Wow, that's quite a late career pivot. Did he have a shot at winning?
Well, he was facing some tough competition from established Republicans,
Right.
including Martha McSally, who eventually won the primary.
I imagine his controversial past didn't exactly help his chances with more moderate voters.
It definitely played a role. His history, including the racial profiling lawsuit and the pardon from President Trump, was front and center during the campaign.
So ultimately, his Senate run fell short. Was it a genuine attempt to win or more of a symbolic gesture?
It's hard to say for sure,
Uh.
but even in his 80s, he was clearly still driven by that desire to serve and fight for what he believed in.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Sheriff Joe Arpaio's life and legacy, what are the key takeaways here? What are the themes that really stand out?
Well, one thing that jumps out at me is the enduring power of controversy. Throughout his career, Arpaio embraced it. Whether it was his unconventional jail policies, his stance on immigration, or his willingness to entertain conspiracy theories, he was never far from the headlines.
Right.
This made him a deeply polarizing figure, both attracting devoted supporters and sparking fierce criticism.
And his career spanned several decades, right? So did his approach to law enforcement evolve over time?
It did. His career reflected those shifting tides in American law enforcement, He came up during the tough-on-crime era, and his methods often reflected that mindset.
Right.
But as the country's demographics changed and concerns about racial profiling and police brutality grew louder, his tactics became more and more controversial.
And those controversies ultimately led to his legal troubles, didn't they?
They certainly contributed to his downfall.
Anything else that really jumps out at you about Arpaio's story?
Well, to me, it underscores the importance of critical thinking. Arpaio often presented himself as a truth seeker, but his embrace of those conspiracy theories and willingness to believe questionable sources raises some serious concerns about his judgment.
It's a reminder that we all need to be critical of the information we encounter,
Right.
especially in a world where misinformation is so easily spread.
Absolutely. And Arpaio's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of holding those in authority accountable for their actions.
Arpaio's definitely a complex figure. He was ambitious, driven by his convictions, and never shied away from a fight. But his methods were often deeply controversial, and his legacy will continue to be debated for years to come.
There's no doubt about that. His story raises important questions about the role of law enforcement in a democracy, the complexities of immigration, and the fine line between pursuing justice and getting caught up in the allure of conspiracy theories.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground here. From his days as a beat cop to his tumultuous time as sheriff, Arpaio's life was anything but ordinary.
Yeah, it really has been quite a journey unpacking all this. From, his early days as a beat cop to his tumultuous time as sheriff. It makes you think about that balance,
Yeah.
between keeping people safe and respecting individual rights.
It really does. And, there's one aspect we haven't really touched on directly that I think is worth pondering. It wasn't explicitly covered in the sources, but, what about the impact of Arpaio's policies on, the very communities he was serving?
That's a really good point. We've talked about his tactics and the legal battles and everything, but how did all of this actually play out in people's lives?
Exactly. Did his approach to law enforcement, erode trust, particularly between law enforcement and minority communities?
Right.
We know he had his supporters.
Yeah.
But what about those who felt targeted or marginalized by his policies? Yeah, that's a crucial question to consider, especially when we talk about the, long-term consequences of his actions. It would be fascinating to hear those perspectives.
Yeah.
To understand the human impact beyond the headlines.
It would. And as you continue to explore Arpaio and everything he represents, I encourage you to, think critically about the information you encounter.
Yeah.
Consider different points of view, weigh the evidence, and ultimately, draw your own conclusions.
Well said. I think we've just scratched the surface here, and there's so much more to uncover. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Sheriff Joe Arpaio. We hope it's given you a new perspective on his complex and controversial legacy.
Yeah, it's a story that continues to resonate today, raising questions about law enforcement, immigration, and the very nature of justice in America.
And remember, as you delve deeper into these issues, keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep learning.